Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar series on the topic Global Health Crisis and Danger for Democratic Principles in Southeastern Europe. Before I start, I would like to express my gratitude to the Atlantic Council of Croatia and Monika Begović for the good cooperation we had in the previous years, and I'm happy to participate, even though we would prefer to do these webinars in physically attending. Still, the situation at the moment does not allow, so I'm happy to share some general thoughts on the topic which I was mentioning before. I would say that there is no doubt that the pandemic created numerous challenges, not only for the region, but for the whole European Union and the whole world in general. States did react quite differently with different approaches and implications and different restrictions for the people. So the people are facing various challenges following the measures which came along with trying to contain the virus. At the core, of course, there is this global health emergency, which requires also global responses, as it is a global problem. Still, the priority seems to be and needs to be to save lives, and special measures were required, and we also do understand that they have implications for principal democratic and freedoms and also human rights in general. There are direct implications resulting from the measures, like for example, the curtailing freedom of movement, the freedom of assembly, the right to work during the shutdown and home office, and right to education when schools were closed, but also freedom of opinion and expression. This also comes along then with some restrictions when it comes to freedom of information, since several people in power were not really very transparent about their cases. How many cases did they have? When were they published daily? Were they counted together? And were they also compared to similar countries in the region or neighboring countries with similar backgrounds? Still, there are also some indirect consequences. For example, the renationalization. We saw that quite astonishingly also within the European Union when the outbreak hit Italy very hard, when like all the countries from the European Union then started to think about how to cope with the situation. And many of them chose, first of all, to see and to secure their own nation's needs for medical treatment. We realized that stockpiling had some problems with the stockpiling of medical equipments, and we also did not really, in the beginning especially, did not really have this feeling of solidarity when it comes to our neighboring countries, because the focus was clearly on the nation state, and we see a renationalization of states even within the European Union during the beginning of the pandemic. We also saw, which is quite interesting, some kind of Eurocentrism rising up again, which was not really that high in the previous years. And what do I mean with Eurocentrism in this context is, for example, that when we would compare to South Korea, we would say they coped a little bit better because they are already used to being a little bit more physical distant than, for example, the Europeans, and they also have already, they are used to these diseases more because they already had SARS and other epidemics. But what we totally lacked in this consideration is that we did not really try to have a very good cooperation also with scientists in the region to see what is actually upcoming to Europe. And I would say that many governments, just in the beginning especially, did not really take seriously what is coming. We also saw ways of discrimination, especially against also Chinese citizens, claiming that they are bringing the virus. I mean, Mr. Trump even called it the Kung flu, so also kind of racism popped up in relation with the virus, and I think this is also something we should have in mind. What are the main challenges now? The main challenges are definitely that this public health crisis already led and will probably also lead to an economic and social crisis. We saw that especially the most vulnerable people, the least protected in society, they were hit quite hard. I mean, when we talk, for example, about refugees and migrants, they did not have the right to seek for asylum since borders were closed. But we also see it for poorer people losing their jobs. This is not going to help. And also elderly people who have been detained in their houses without contacts to their family. We also saw a rise in domestic violence during the lockdown. So I think it's very important that we take into account the very vulnerable people when it comes to how we cope with the crisis. These special measures, of course, are in some way justified, but it is very important and very crucial that the responses to the crisis must be proportionate to the pandemic. This is especially important in order to preserve the trust between people and the government, and also to ensure the protection of fundamental rights. The access and enjoyment for political rights and civil liberties already have been rated quite low in the Western Balkan countries, even before the crisis. Bosnia and Herzegovina at the bottom has 53 points according to the Freedom House rating, which rates the political rights and civil liberties, and Albania, which is the highest, has 67 points. And if we compare it, for example, to Germany and Austria with 94, 93% points, and Norway and Finland and Sweden to 100%. So this needs to be taken into account that even before the pandemic, there were some challenges in the Western Balkan countries. More specifically, for the region, we saw some very interesting developments also politically. The government in Kosovo, for example, was toppled during the crisis with a vote of non-confidence against Mr. Kurtli, actually quite shortly after the government was even formed. We know that afterwards, Hoti became prime minister without holding snap elections, a move which was also widely perceived as anti-democratic by activists and opposition. We also saw that people then during the lockdown were protesting outside on their balconies, and this is something I would say which we need also to consider when talking about the Western Balkans. Another case I would like to raise is probably what happened in Serbia in the election period. Serbia lifted the lockdown quite early in order to hold the elections, only to reintroduce it after the elections with very, very strong measures. So that was perceived quite not transparent by the people themselves, even though Serbia also said they are going to lower the threshold for other parties to enter the parliament. But we also know that the opposition was blocking and boycotting the whole election. So it is really difficult about how legitimacy in these times are perceived, and why the lockdown was reintroduced after lifting it so the elections could be held. And we had a massive wave of protests in Belgrade right after the election, so people going onto the street and demanding more transparency, demanding also that the government was probably not even that open with them when it comes to how severe the situation is. Maybe, but also to say something more positive, is that the opening of accession talks with Albania and North Macedonia should be seen positive, but still, I mean, we also see that the Hungarian enlargement commissioner comes from Hungary, a country within the European Union with massive backslides in democratic freedoms and democracy shifting towards a so-called, what Viktor Orban even calls, a liberal democracy, whatever that might be. So these are also challenges for especially the progressive forces in the Western Balkan regions, who claim also their governments to be more democratic, to follow the European Union values in order to become at one point in the quite still distant future, but nevertheless to become a member of the European Union, which has to be, which was also already confirmed and is still even confirmed by the European Union, not only in Zagreb in 2000 and Thessaloniki afterwards. Even France is not challenging the European Union perspective. Still, there are also this whole situation of the European Union focusing more on national stockpiling of medication, to see that their national people are getting healthy and are getting good access to healthcare. We also see that other countries, especially external actors, China and Russia, would somehow enter the scene. I mean, they already have been there before, but we could see quite interestingly that China really raised this strategic opportunism, not only because of humanitarian support, of course, but also because they wanted to use and advocate for their Belt and Road Initiative, and also, of course, to ensure their political influence, also probably against the European Union, who has, of course, a quite big interest in the stability of the region, considering it's all enclosed it's surrounded by European Union member states, and the perspective is there, and not considering also the historical past and all the people-to-people contacts, of course, we are having. Additionally, I mean, we have also to say that China was in the beginning, when European Union was still somehow puzzled and did not really react. China already sent medical equipment and also experts, but it was also reported afterwards that many of the equipment, a lot of the equipment was actually flawed and often not really usable. We also see that especially populists and nationalists afterwards praise their good relations with China and Russia, and this also, of course, plays into the hands of China and Russia, who are not really, when it comes to the bigger picture, to the whole global world order, who are challenging also this kind of Western, how can we put it, this Western idea of Western liberties, democracy. These things, all these things are perceived quite differently in China and Russia. And of course, they also have an interest in presenting themselves against the US and the European Union, and to give another idea of how a future value-based system could look like, and also to shape also the idea of how these values could look in the future. If we look at the other very important actor, which is of course the European Union, we see that the European Union in the region is often perceived as weak and is not really doing enough. This is of course also sometimes fueled by statements for, like example, Alexander Vučić, who was saying that the European Union membership is not enough for mutual recognition of Kosovo and Serbia, and also that the European Union doesn't know what to offer to Serbia. I mean, this is it's his right to say these things, and it is probably also true that the European Union takes some time to act, but it's also neglecting that the European Union still is the biggest donor in the region. The European Union even offered Serbia a stockpile of medical equipment, but also of economic recovery, like millions, I think it was 93 million euros, which was offered to Serbia alone just to cope with the pandemic. And this is also in line with what the other European Union member states are advocating for. Of course, we have the difficulties within the European Union, which are also not new. For example, Brexit, immigration. We see the economic disparities within the European Union. We have democratic backslides in Poland and in Hungary. We have different crises in the European neighborhood now, for example, Belarus and Ukraine, which is still there, but also Libya, Northern Africa. And then when you go more to the Middle Eastern region, what you see in Lebanon and the situation there is also, of course, all these challenges are not vanishing because of the pandemic. So this is also one of the biggest problems, why the European Union kind of is sometimes also slow in reacting. Still, the European Union does know, and it should also be knowing, that the Western Balkans is strategically important to them, and it is important not only for the European Union but for the West at large. If you look at the map, we still can see like where the Western Balkans are located, and we should not forget about this. So maybe not to get too long, I would like to conclude, and maybe then afterwards in the webinar series we can discuss these issues even more. We must totally understand that the European Union must remain or become more united and active in the region, for example, like the Western Balkans. Also in pursuit of integration into the Western institutions, there are several ways where cooperation could be fostered without now full integration. It could be with more economic ties, but also when it comes, for example, to Kosovo visa liberalization. We should still be quite active when it comes to the problems with Kosovo and Serbia, not leaving it all then to Grenell and to US and leaving out Lajčák, who is actually responsible from part of the European Union and who has its legitimacy in order to help to facilitate with the dialogue. The European Union should stick to its commitments made to the Western Balkans. The future is within the European Union, but it should not be unconditionally. The European Union has to address democratic backslides in the region. The European Parliament can do this. The European Parliament can be a good mediator, as it is also probably one of the most democratic institutions from the European Union itself. Nevertheless, the responsibility does not lie solely upon the European Union. It also lies upon the Western Balkans, and the Western Balkan countries also need to be clear about where their strategic orientation is going without playing the external actors. I only mentioned Russia and China, but of course also the Emirates and Turkey play a very big role, and of course the US. Without playing them against the European Union, because even though the rhetoric sometimes might be quite positive, especially in Serbia when it comes to Russia, if you ask the people then afterwards, also probably the Serbian government, where would you like your children to go to study and to find a job maybe, or to travel, most of them will probably not send them to Russia, but to European Union countries, Germany, Austria. We also need to be very clear that the responses to the pandemic, even though measures might be strict, but they still have to be appropriate and proportionate, and they have to take into account the most vulnerable people. I already mentioned before the refugees, and if we now look at the situation in Moria, in the refugee camp in Greece, which is a European Union country and is also bordering the Western Balkan region, we see that the European Union countries were very inactive in those last months, not taking into account what is going on there. And now with the disaster happening there and people being on the street and fights with the police and tear gas is used, even also against children, the European Union also needs to be quite clear and also stick to its values and also stick to the most vulnerable people and try to, especially to protect the most vulnerable. We should never forget about these. I have not been mentioning minorities in the different countries, but of course this is also a very important point. And even though the pandemic is not yet overcome, and it might still take some time, we also still need to have a focus, the Western Balkans, but also the European Union, on other issues which are of utmost importance, which is the Kosovo and Serbia relation. I mean, some things are going on right now there, but also the visa liberalization I mentioned already before for Kosovo, but also institutional reforms, the freedom of media, which is a big challenge, not only in Serbia, but also in other countries, and also the electoral processes. They have to be monitored. I mean, the European Parliament could function as a mediator there, and it was also tried, but the opposition, especially in Serbia, was saying that it was not enough, which led to the still ultimate boycott when the elections have been there. So in the end, I would say it's very important that even due to the pandemic, that we should talk about values, but not as a buzzword. European Union values, not as a buzzword, but also what it actually means, because European values do have a content, and it is important to see that the human dignity, freedom, and democracy lie at the heart of the European Union values, and this is also codified in Article 2 and EUV. So discrimination, pluralism, tolerance, justice, but also solidarity and equality are the main fundamentals on which the Union is based upon, and this should also be communicated clearly with the Western Balkan countries, and also we should give them support to meet the fulfillment of these values, and to have a prosperous future, and to take into account that at one point we will get over the pandemic, even though if we might need to live with it a little bit more. But I'm also happy then to discuss all these issues with you in the webinar, and hopefully also soon, physically. And that it is right now for me, and I look forward to interesting discussions and hope that everyone takes care and stays well. Thank you.
2020 was a year of unprecedented challenges in the world. The world has never seen a complete lockdown and abruption of normal life as we have seen in this year. At the same time, this year was a year of huge security challenges around the world, and luckily NATO was there, ready and able to respond to these challenges. In this period of crisis, NATO showed that it demonstrated once again its ability to react. It was there to assure the member states that this organization is here regardless of the complete lockdown that we've seen. NATO was active. All the activities that were in place before the eruption of Corona crisis was there, and it was even augmented. Its capacities were demonstrated around the world. NATO continued to conduct its activities and to demonstrate its values in the member states and across the globe. NATO made its presence in Afghanistan public with a number of initiatives, also with the CAB initiative in the Middle East. It was fully dedicated to all initiatives that it's conducted in Eastern Europe with countries involved in the Eastern Partnership, including countries like Moldova. So NATO was there for the third countries, not countries that are seeing NATO's presence, the countries that want to join NATO, and the countries that have engaged in some kind of partnership with NATO. And on the other hand, NATO was there for its members within NATO member countries. It was there to deliver security. It was there to secure their support. NATO was also conducting its operations, including KFOR in Kosovo. So it made its presence pretty clear and adamantly evident and strong, regardless of this period of crisis. And it ensured all the allies within the alliance that it's strong and that its cohesion is not shattered. What's also important is that NATO was there to deliver a strong message when it came to deteriorating relations between the West and China. As we see in this period of hybrid warfare that we see all around the world, and cybersecurity threats around the globe, and this hybrid warfare and war of information between the West and the new race between the United States as the most important, the biggest ally within the NATO alliance. NATO was there to support its members and to say that it's a union of, it's a community of values. NATO is there for its allies, and NATO will not back up when it comes to defending the values of North Atlantic Alliance. It was there to say that NATO is willing to defend values of NATO allies, and it was there to face the threats coming through the propaganda machine coming from Russia and China. So it gave this security, in this taste of security, the sense of security in time of unease and tension between major rivals like Russia and China that want to challenge special American presence in Eastern Europe and strong NATO cohesion of Eastern Europe, and of course they want to challenge NATO member states, foremost United States in the Pacific. What also needs to say is in this period of crisis, NATO was there in the region of Southeast Europe. It pointed out its strong message for the countries in the region that it's there for them. For instance, the newest member state of NATO, Montenegro, that faced just a few days ago the general election. NATO was there to say for Montenegro that it stands with Montenegro, its member state, since 2017. We witnessed some attempts to question the regularity of the election in 2016 in Montenegro. There was unrest, civil unrest, since the beginning of this year in Montenegro. This is extremely fragile and important part of the countries, NATO members in Southeast Europe. And Montenegro protects the eastern part of the Adriatic against malign influence of Russia in this region, and NATO was there to say that it watches what's going on with the situation in Montenegro. And now, after the election, when obviously we're going to see a change of rule after 30 years of dominance of DPS, the Socialist Party, Democratic Socialist Party in Montenegro. Now we see that NATO is involved. Three major coalitions of parties that won the election have just a few days ago signed an agreement, basically a declaration that Montenegro, with the new government, once it's formed, expected to be sometime in October, that Montenegro will remain dedicated to NATO values. Montenegro will remain, of course, within the membership, and it will continue to grow and to develop within NATO membership, and will strive for another part of the EuroAtlantic integration that's joining the European Union. So by no way can we talk about deterioration in Montenegro, that the Russian influence has taken over. It seems and it's obvious that Montenegro is going to remain dedicated to its membership within NATO, and the NATO is going to remain strong in this region. NATO also closely watches what's going on in Kosovo, what's going on in Serbia. And of course, we've seen this accord in the White House between Serbia and Kosovo, and it's a major step ahead. And NATO is there to support countries that in the future might join NATO, even including Serbia, who experienced military campaign 20 years ago. So these EuroAtlantic values that NATO promotes are strong. NATO's cohesion in the region is strong. Montenegro's membership within NATO is going to remain strong, and NATO is going to remain fully dedicated to the region and to promoting the values, especially at this time of uncertainty, when we face an unprecedented crisis in the world, when we see growing malign influence from third parties, mostly Russia and China, that want to undermine this cohesion in the region of Southeast Europe, in Eastern Europe, especially Russia. China trying to penetrate deep into the Balkans and the rest of the region. So NATO's role is again demonstrating to be unparalleled and unchallenged, and the only solid bedrock of security in the region, and the guarantor of North Atlantic values in the region.
The topic of the last webinar of this international webinar school is related to the importance of EuroAtlantic values and how these EuroAtlantic values and transatlantic cooperation influence the security in Southeastern Europe, with a special aspect to the Western Balkan region. Actually, today we can also talk about the main topic of this international webinar school, that is related to global health crisis and how this global health crisis influences the world security. So it is important to tackle the role of NATO in all of these global health crises as a security provider, but also to stress how solidarity as a Euro-Atlantic value became one of the most important values in today's world, especially for keeping this stability. Main statements in this presentation will be related to 3 points. So actually the presentation is divided in 3 parts. The first part, I will just briefly mention the polarity in the New World Order. The main statements in the presentation will be related to the 3 points. So the presentation will be divided in 3 parts. In the first part, I will talk about very briefly about polarity in the New World Order. In the second part, I will tackle Euro-Atlantic values and how they affect stability and security. And in the third part, how cooperation and regional integration in Southeastern Europe is enhanced through the implementation of Euro-Atlantic values. So concerning the polarity in international relations, we can say that polarity shows the various ways in which power is distributed throughout the world. So we had bipolarity until the 90s, we had then unipolarity, and in today's world we have multipolarity. Multipolarity is a system in which several states possess a considerable degree of political influences. And this could be tricky actually. So system of multipolarity increases rivalry in global politics, and the reason is that many states of similar strength compete among each other for power and influence. These countries are very often uncertain in other states' intentions, so this increases the possibility of instability. So the power of balance in this type of system, in multipolar system, is constantly changing, and that is something that can be tricky. It can be very well explained through tackling this neorealism, that is a very interesting theory in international relations that has a very pessimistic view of human nature. And through this pessimistic view of human nature, it actually relates and making analogy to the states, how states behave in international relations because they pursue only their own interests. And from neorealistic point of view, the international system is anarchic. So conclusion that the multipolar balancing brings uncertainty. And that is the world we are living today, in a multipolar system that explained through neorealistic theory of international relations brings uncertainty. And therefore, it leads to my second part of the presentation, which is related to the importance of Euro-Atlantic values and how they contribute to the stability and security. But first, let us think what the world has in common. And in international security, world shares common threats. common threats that every country is, let's say, afraid of. So that can be terrorism, nuclear proliferation, regional crisis, and lately global health crisis. So let me ask a question now, and we can then discuss on our online Zoom conferences next week. Can common threats, before we tackle about EuroAtlantic values, can common threats lead towards better connection and better relation among countries? So now, just briefly to see NATO-EU cooperation and their relation of this good cooperation to the common values. So regional politics, when we talk about Western Balkan region that I mentioned in the beginning, regional politics are somehow struggling with the paradox of progress, having constantly ups and downs along the path towards their wider integration, meaning regional integration and international integration. During this process, the leitmotifs of their wish to integrate into EuroAtlantic integrations are EuroAtlantic values. And those are freedom, democracy, good governance, rule of law, individual liberty, peace and stability, functional market economy, and what I mentioned in the beginning, very important value, solidarity. They are important, all values, and crucial, not only for the political agenda, but especially they are very important for the citizens, as they bring reforms that are important for citizens' daily lives, and citizens can feel that in their daily lives. So EuroAtlantic values are actually universal citizens' rights that are political, economic, and social rights. They are pushing actually countries to stream towards improving their internal policies. To go back to the Western Balkan region, geopolitically this region is an important region both for EU and NATO. And in all strategies that are related to the improvement of conditions in Western Balkan countries, an accent is put on good regional cooperation, good neighborly relations, as a prerogative for their integration process. So in this integration process that countries in the region are constantly trying to improve, we have these EuroAtlantic values that are actually leading internal reforms for the benefits of the citizens that we mentioned, and for the process of joining EuroAtlantic integration. In that way, the prospect of EU and NATO integration remains as the main vehicle towards the achievement of regional peace and stability. And when we have regional peace and stability, we can also talk about even wider peace and stability. However, we have to be very cautious about the interpretation of these EuroAtlantic values. Interpretation in the daily media, interpretation in social media, in all kinds of media that are actually sometimes serving different interests. So interpretation and presentation of EuroAtlantic values is very important for the peace of stability if we want to claim, as I do now here, that they are actually prerogatives for peace and stability. So when we have EuroAtlantic values, they lead towards EuroAtlantic oriented attitude and behavior. And then we have EuroAtlantic oriented politics. However, when they are misinterpreted in public opinion and in politics, then we have external influence that is leading towards this misinterpretation. We have redefined EuroAtlantic values. We have influence of propaganda. We have different kinds of manipulation. And that leads to redefined EuroAtlantic values, informational fog that is being created because of redefining citizens and political policymakers are not understanding them fully. So we have swinging behavior and political opinion, and that leads towards loss of certain EuroAtlantic values, international chaos possibly, political crisis in society, and loss of EuroAtlantic political course. So in the end of this presentation, and I didn't want to be long because I wanted to open some issues just to make sure that we can discuss and we can have opinions, and we can hear opinions of our young participants of our online Zoom conferences next week. As conclusion, I will not actually have conclusion. I will have two questions. First is Western Balkan region actually a buffer zone or a playground, as some authors are calling, for regional and global players who are trying to have the best possible geostrategic and geopolitical position? And my second question is, how is solidarity, as the Euro-Atlantic value that I mentioned in the beginning and stressed its value, seen as a value in this pandemic crisis? Is it misinterpreted? Is it sometimes manipulated? Or is it seen as it is? This is the end of my presentation, and as a host, I'm the last speaker of the last webinar in this international webinar school that we, as the Atlantic Council of Croatia, organized under the sponsorship of NATO Public Diplomacy Division, to which we thank for the cooperation. However, I would like to express my big thank also to our expert speakers who made this webinar school educational, and with their excellent presentations, a food for thought, I would say. I would welcome you all for our Zoom online conferences that will take place on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday next week. And I'm looking forward in exchanging ideas, opinions, and knowledge. Thank you very much to all of you for good cooperation.